Of course, we know that from the standard psychiatric point of view, if a person is very, very suspicious and doesn't trust other people, they might get a diagnosis of paranoid psychosis. This is a very, very severe diagnosis. It's likely to be a diagnosis that you could never get rid of and is likely to affect your life in a very difficult way. And I want to give this example of an alternative viewpoint about so-called paranoia. Let's call it suspicion. That's a better word to use. It's less loaded. That comes from someone with lived experience. And this comes from a paper that I found extremely useful and very exciting about paranoia by a woman called Liz Pitt, who some of you may know. I heard Liz talk about, present this paper in 2004, and she very kindly gave me a copy of it so I could quote from it. Liz Pitt, let me just tell you a little bit about her experience. When she was in her early 40s, began having experiences of suspicion that led her to be diagnosed as paranoid. She was, at the time, she was living in Manchester, and she was working very intensively with a group that was trying to, this was in the 1980s, was trying to free Northern Ireland from British control. She was in an activist group. She wasn't in Sinn Féin itself, but she was in an allied group, and she was spending a lot of time working with these political ideas. And in the 1990s, after a long time of working with this group, she started to believe that her house was being watched. And she thought that people had identified her as a police informer. And she became very distressed at the idea that her friends were going to turn her in to the police. And I'm going to quote a couple of things from Liz Pitt's paper from 2004. She says, quote, "My paranoid beliefs," let's put that word in inverted commas, "my paranoid beliefs centered on the idea that I had a split personality which could influence the Irish peace process. I believed that she, the split personality, had links with the security forces and had given them information on my friends, putting their lives at risk. I imagined that I was going to be tortured to death by the left for acts of betrayal, or burnt to death by fascists, or taken to Northern Ireland and tortured to death by loyalists for my own activities in support of Irish republicanism. Death was a very real fear to me, and I can't impress on people enough how scary it is to believe that you're going to die." That's how she felt. She felt that she was going to be turned in and she was going to be tortured as a consequence of her political beliefs. Now, she emphasizes in this paper that she wrote that these ideas themselves were not really crazy. And I don't have to tell you, living in Birmingham, the home of the Birmingham Six, that there were plenty of examples of people who were falsely accused of various acts and even pressured by the police to confess to acts that they had not committed, and were the objects of surveillance, and in many ways were in a situation that felt very, very frightening to them, and certainly was one of suspicion. And as Liz Pitt says in this paper, the fear of surveillance and informers was an accepted part of the political culture I operated within. That was not the crazy part. That was all true. As she says, what we could call paranoid in her thinking was the idea that these particular things were going to happen to her specifically. In other words, she was operating in a culture with a lot of suspicion, but was she personally going to be tortured to death because of her ideas? That was the part that was a little bit more problematic. So she says, in that sense, I had a distorted sense of my own reality, but not of the larger political reality that surrounded my feelings. Now, I think what's so striking about Liz Pitt's paper, and the reason I quote it here, is because it contrasts so sharply with what the psychiatrist that she was treated by said about patients like her. They argued that there was no connection between her paranoia and any of her life experiences. They said that her paranoia was a brain disease that had nothing at all to do with what she was doing in terms of political activity or Irish republicanism or anything else. And they said that she really just needed to take a medication and that would get rid of these feelings. And one of the most painful parts of her paper and her presentation was this part, which I'll read to you. She said that at first she herself was terrified and of being tortured, and she thought she needed help. And she arrived at a local hospital at the A&E ward with a handwritten note. She was too frightened to speak, and she had a note, and she handed this note to the person who met her in the A&E ward, and the note said, "Please help me." But what happened to her then was that she was put in a hospital, she was given a lot of medication, which she found to be not helpful at all, and no one listened to anything that she had to say about her experiences, which is why she wrote this paper that I'm quoting from. And she says, I think this is a quite sad statement about mental health treatment. She says, quote, "I wouldn't do that now. I've come to believe that what psychiatry has to offer is labels and medication." And she says, "I can't understand why none of the psychiatrists who treated me were willing to discuss or understand my beliefs within the context of my life experience." And one of the things she talks about in this paper was the crisis that she was thrown into when she took a course in university about Irish politics. And she learned a lot of things that contradicted what those people in her political group were arguing. And she felt an internal struggle about what to think. And so, big surprise. Then she developed a, quote, delusion in which she had a split personality where one set of ideas were over here and another set of ideas were over here. In other words, she's saying, if you want to understand how I came to have this delusion, you have to know about my political work, my taking this university course, what all the people I knew thought, the political culture in which I operated, where I lived, etc. That's what you needed to know in order to understand how I came to have these difficulties. And so I'm giving that as an example of, again, how we can see that someone with lived experience is providing an account of what's happened to them and their, quote, symptoms that helps us to make sense of them. If we don't have any of this context and we say, wow, how weird, she thought she had a split personality, why would she think that? Must be her brain function. I find it a lot more helpful to understand why she thought these things, to read this paper of hers, in which she's articulating, I think very insightfully, what experiences led to these particular feelings. And I don't know if you've read the work of Tamsin Knight. Tamsin Knight is another person who's had lived experience of what psychiatrists have called paranoia. Happily, she's now in training to be a psychiatrist and provide an alternative viewpoint about these things. Tamsin Knight wrote a wonderful paper in which she theorizes these kinds of experiences based on her experience and those of people like Liz Pitt. And one of the things that she suggests, partly informed by the Hearing Voices Network, she suggests replacing a word like paranoia, which is very, very laden with value-laden assumptions and negativity. Tamsin Knight suggests replacing that with the more neutral phrase, beliefs that might not be easily confirmable, or unshared beliefs. And you can see the parallel there, in the same way that the Hearing Voices Network suggested hearing voices as a more neutral way to describe those experiences. Beliefs that might not be easily confirmable. is a good way of describing this. And Tamsin Knight actually also points out, I found this helpful, she pointed out at a recent conference, let me just quote here a couple of lines from her paper, "Once we focus on what the person is actually experiencing, which is a deep commitment to an idea that other people question, or an idea that can't be easily proved, we see that there are a lot of people about whom this might be said." And she gave the example of Tony Blair, who of course believed in the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. He believed that very, very strongly. Those of you who've heard him testify recently at the Chilcot Inquiry will know that he continues to believe in those weapons of mass destruction, even though we would agree there is no evidence for these weapons in the usual sense of evidence. No one could find them when they looked for them. And if you asked other people, are they there? They would say, well, I don't know. Nobody could find them. However, he believed in them very strongly. So calling this a belief that might not be easily confirmable, or an unshared belief, helps us to see how, for instance, scientists who have a very, very strong belief in their own hypothesis, people who are very strongly religious, who believe very strongly in some religious ideas that might not be easily confirmable, they're not that different from an idea like Liz Pitt's. Now, that doesn't mean everyone should be called paranoid. That means that we should ask questions about how we draw the line between ideas that aren't easily confirmable, that get called mental health problems, and those that get called religious beliefs, political beliefs, and so on.